This week, we are taking up one of the most famous of all World War I texts, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. This book was published in 1929, during the great wave of war memoirs and novels that emerged about 10 years after the war. This flowering of narratives perhaps represented a moment in which those who had experienced the war had gained sufficient distance from it to be able to talk about their experiences, while also reflecting the way in which the war had never left any of those who suffered from it. All Quiet is a novel, not a memoir, and yet it feels very viscerally true to us, and also to the original readers of the novel, who included former soldiers as well as non-combatants. Remarque's book was an immediate success, and was widely read not just in Germany, where it was first published, but in the many nations into whose languages it was translated. The protagonist of the novel is a German foot soldier, like Remarque, and also like the future Adolf Hitler. But his experience of the war resonated with former enlisted men and officers on both sides of the conflict. All Quiet presents an anti-war message. It doesn't see either side as more righteous or justified, and it understands the war as primarily a gigantic waste of people and materials. But it also presents the German army in a less than perfectly favorable light. This is now a typical way for soldiers, especially enlisted men, to describe their armies. But of course, such an approach contains the possibility of offending certain kinds of military veterans. And sure enough, Hitler hated this book because it showed the German army realistically rather than through rose-colored glasses. He felt this was beneath the dignity of Germany, and so one of his first acts upon coming to power was to seize and burn all the copies of this book that he could. As we begin to read All Quiet, it's very important to pay attention to how Remarque achieves his effects in the novel. We feel intimately connected to Paul. How does this happen? Well, it happens through the narrative structure. All Quiet features a first-person limited narrator who chiefly uses we rather than I to describe the action of the book. Thus, readers focus on the unit, the group of friends surrounding Paul, more than on any individual. That's what Paul sees as the really important feeling of his war experience, much more than the fear of a bombardment or the boredom of life in reserve. Remarque also tends to restrict his words and his sentence structures to simple, straightforward modes. Now, it isn't true that the style of the whole book is just the facts, ma'am, but it is true that the book mostly feels like that to readers. Remarque isolates the everyday as he explores the experience of fighting in the war, and no example could be more apt than the way the book opens with the soldiers excited over the prospect of extra beans for dinner. In this scene, we see everything we need to know to begin to interpret the book. The men are usually hungry, but today will be amply fed. The proximate cause of this is the decimation of their unit and loss of comrades in battle. Structures of the Army, including the Quartermaster Corps that controls rations, are overly focused on military regulations in ways that align their interests against those of ordinary soldiers. Successful soldiers are adept at getting around these regulations, usually by outsmarting those charged with enforcing them. We understand the soldiers who will feature in the novel as old hands who know the war well, and who are well equipped to handle whatever it throws at them. It is a surprise to discover that these hardened veterans are only 20 years old. Cat, the oldest and wiliest of the companions, looks after his comrades with fatherly care that defines the bonds of comradeship as love. Mixed in with this focus on the everyday are passages charged with heightened emotion. In writing scenes of battle, Remarque often brings his literary big guns to bear, as in the apostrophe to the earth that begins during the first big battle scene of the novel. The terror and helplessness of the soldier in battle, feelings that may be present among soldiers in all wars, but that are clearly exacerbated by the peculiar conditions of World War I, translate to elevated diction, obvious use of literary techniques, and narrative that is out of time rather than a straight chronological telling of events. Later this semester, we'll see a similar technique deployed by Edmund Blunden in his memoir. It is useful to think about why writers as different as Remarque, who came to fiction through journalism, and Blunden, a classically trained poet, deploy such similar techniques. Perhaps the experience of being in the front lines, being bombarded, having to cross no man's land, is so far from contiguous to regular life that it demands such an extreme literary response. Meanwhile, camp experiences, while certainly quite different from the lives Paul and his friends had led at home, at least concern homely things like eating, sleeping, and taking care of one's physical needs. In the war zone, everything is heightened by fear and by base survival instincts, the need to seek shelter in the earth from the falling shells and whizzing bullets. Also typical of how the text is structured is the passage near the beginning where Paul's friend dies. In this case, we see genuine friendship. Paul, for instance, does what he can to reassure and to care for his friend, including seeking a doctor at the moment his friend dies, though he had already acknowledged that his friend is dying and there is nothing to be done for him. But that genuine connection is complicated by the friend's interest in the very good boots that are now unneeded by their comrade. Relations between comrades at the front are both especially devoted and intense and incredibly pragmatic. When a comrade dies, you make what use you can of his absence, whether that's in the form of boots or beans, and then move on. Even the dying man recognizes that the best thing he can do for his friends is to bequeath the boots, which he himself got from a dead Englishman. The boots will spend the rest of the novel being handed from one soldier to another, an artifact that marks the high mortality rate of young men like Paul. Your forum this week is a writing exercise that requires you to think carefully about style. You will find a PowerPoint on Blackboard to walk you through the steps of this week's forum assignment. Please make sure you follow all the steps. The slideshow ends with images of the tower poppies, so don't stop until you get there.